Okay, for this week we're looking at between the world wars. A movement that was very, very powerful and influential was something known as Dada. The word Dada has many different explanations as to where it came from. None of them really matter, really, which was the correct interpretation of why they got the name Dada. It was meant to be a sort of nonsensical word, and their art was also very nonsensical in the way that it was conceived and the way that it was executed. But to understand Dada, we really have to understand the historical context of the culture of Europe at the time and the art that was being produced by the writers, the musicians, and the visual artists. World War I was a bit of an understatement, really, to say it was a shock. It was a wake-up call, and it confirmed what very many people in Europe knew all along, that Europe was just a time bomb waiting to explode. And World War I really was the first war in human history that one could actually call mechanized. And by that I mean airplanes dropping bombs from the sky, machine guns, tanks, that kind of mechanical warfare, which led to an astronomical increase in the number of deaths fighting in Europe and between the two warring factions. And so for many of the people in Europe, it was really hard to sort of square the idea of a civilized, developed, educated society and culture, like many Europeans felt themselves to be, and the brutal carnage and decimation of human life and towns and people and not just soldiers but women and children, all on a scale that had never been seen before. And like I said, done through a very mechanized way. So this kind of inhumanity and this kind of brutality really shook up a lot of people in Europe. And for many of them, many of the artists and the musicians and the writers at the time, they saw the quote-unquote civilized nature of late 19th century Europe as essentially a sham, that civilization was a veneer, a very thin veneer, under which there was a lot of sickness and repression and hypocrisy. And for them, World War I was just a giant lesion or sore that just opened and erupted onto Europe. And it sort of laid waste to any kind of pretensions of, well, we're a culture or a society that is in any way has a claim to the word civilized. And so many of the artists were coming from that point of view when they reacted against their society. And that reaction took many, many forms. One of those forms, as we see here in Marcel Duchamp's uh, defacement of the Mona Lisa, was to take those things that Western culture, Western civilization had considered the canons, the great examples, the exemplars of high culture and high art, and to poke fun at them. To take something like the Mona Lisa and say, okay, well, whatever type of culture says that this is the greatest painting that has ever existed, uh, we have no respect for this culture, and what they consider great, we won't consider great. And so part of it was a rather tongue-in-cheek, a humorous, but also a deadly serious poke at the edifice that European civilization was resting upon. And so great artworks like Michelangelo, like Da Vinci, Rubens, Titian, these all became targets for a lot of these artists to desecrate, to make fun of. And their making fun of was a childish act, hence the name Dada. Like I said, it was also tongue-in-cheek. It was also a joke. Part of the tongue-in-cheek in this piece, for example, is the letters at the bottom of the picture. Duchamp, he gets the credit of being the first person in history, as far as we know, to draw a mustache on another person's picture by putting the mustache and the beard on the Mona Lisa and then writing the letters below. He created a very sort of enigmatic type of defacement. So Duchamp traded a lot in puns and jokes and riddles and sort of inside jokes. And so the letters at the bottom of this image, if you were to pronounce them in the French, in other words, say the letters in the French, you would have Elle a au cul, and if we translate that, it means she has a hot ass. So here's Duchamp making fun of the Mona Lisa, but really he's making fun of Western civilization. And part of this, like I say, is quite childish, but the other half of it is really very serious. What Duchamp and what Dada were doing was not only flipping off Western civilization by creating works themselves that were considered irrational and crazy, but also a very serious critique of the whole idea of culture in general and the value and the meaning of artworks. I'll develop that in a little bit. We'll keep going. We're looking at a piece now by Jean Arp. It was very typical of the Dada artists to create stuff using random techniques. So this piece was claimed to be squares of paper thrown in the air and landing on the floors, having that sort of very random composition. And I think if anybody looks at this and thinks about it quite seriously, it's highly unlikely that they would have landed in this rather perfect grid-like pattern, equally spaced and all sort of oriented in the same direction. So according to this piece, I think we can say that no, this isn't a random piece. This isn't a very good example. But I use it just to demonstrate that they had 2 feet, one in traditional European culture and one in this new world that was being made, but was having, at this stage at least, birth pains. And so there was poetry that was written randomly, there was music that was written randomly, and there were attempts at visual art that were created randomly. And the idea of being random was you're taking away conscious control of the creation of the artwork. Now one might wonder, well, why would you want to do that? You're creating artworks which don't have a creator. Well, part of the Dada movement was to criticize this notion of a creator, a genius, someone who is special and different than others, who is selected from the crowd and creates great, wonderful works of art. But more than that, they were criticizing the critics and the type of culture that enshrines this sort of art. And so randomness and silliness and irrationality were responses to this, and so the art took a lot of those forms. They were criticized for being irrational and for being irresponsible types of artists and acting in a very immature way. And their response to that was, we're immature, we're irrational, we're irresponsible, what have you done? And at that point they would just look out the window at the decimated landscape of Europe and say, come on guys, let's try and get things a little more clear here. We're just working with art. We're playing around with images. You're playing around with people's lives. So if you really want to lay criticism on irrationality, don't look towards the arts. We're just mirroring the type of society we live in. But more importantly, they were also critiquing the type of society. And so we come to this piece. This is Duchamp's well-known Fountain of 1917. This piece is an iconic work of 20th century art. By that I mean it had a huge influence on the art that came after. And this really is what separates contemporary art and modern art from everything that went before. The short answer to how did it do that was it was introducing the idea of the concept, the idea, into art and into culture. This is very important. In order to understand a lot of the art that happens from 1917 to the present day, we have to understand that what artists are working at and working in is a cultural level of communication of ideas. Gone are the days of pretty pictures, of making nice paintings of landscapes or portraits. This started to dissolve as we saw in the 19th century. Photography came along. It did a great job of reproducing all of that. And artists had spent the last 500 years since the Renaissance creating pictorial space, creating volume, dealing with chiaroscuro, making highly, highly realistic images. But quite frankly, artists got bored with that. We saw that in the work of Picasso. Anybody with enough training could produce a work like the Mona Lisa today, believe it or not. The developments that these artists were known for were usually innovations in style and subject matter. Technique was something that artists, at least at this stage of the game, felt anybody could learn. And so the idea of a painting or an artwork being valuable because it was pretty, or because it has a lot of detail, or because it took a long time to make, these were criteria that artists were no longer interested in. They were looking at a whole new set of arrangements. And so we have to understand that we cannot look at this art using those sorts of criteria. We can't look at it through those glasses because the artist is not trying to do that. So what is the artist trying to do here? Okay, I gave you the short answer, introducing the idea of ideas and concepts into art. The long answer is this piece has two components. A little bit of a history about it first. Duchamp was a member of an art society in the United States, Society of Independent Artists, and they had a group show where anybody who was a member was allowed to submit work. And everybody's submission would be exhibited. Well, Duchamp submitted this under a pseudonym. He didn't claim it was his. It's signed by somebody called R. Mutt, somebody who had become a member and paid their dues. And Duchamp was part of the hanging committee. So all the works were dropped off, and when they came across this piece with its slip of paper, its entrance fee and everything paid, the committee was at a loss as to what to think about this. They threw at it all the usual attacks or comments that any commonsensical person would. It's not a piece of art, nobody made it, it's a found object, it's not artistic. And Duchamp, as a member of that committee, began to defend the piece on every single one of those grounds. So in terms of it's not made by somebody, it's made in a factory, Duchamp claimed, well, you know, it was actually designed by someone, and a lot of thought went into the shape and the holes and the whole aesthetic, you know, and he would point to all sorts of things like chairs and tables and windows, and how the aesthetic element of design is a crucial part of just about everything in our physical world. When people criticized it for being mass-produced and not a singular work, again, he looked and commented about many artworks in the past that were produced in workshops and factories, or things like prints that were reproductions of multiples of one original version. He also compared the white, sleek, soft polish to that of marble sculpture, and the finish and the purity of white. Needless to say, the committee wasn't buying it, but he was, you know, defending it and saying, well, we did say that we would exhibit every single member. But what this was really doing, and what Duchamp was trying to do by it, was he was trying to say two things. One, art is nothing to do really with the object. That art has everything to do with the network of relations that surround a piece of work. And by that he meant the gallery owners, the museum directors, the artists, the critics, the writers. And he was saying that what we consider art is really enshrined in the very power and the choices of these social institutions, that it has nothing at all to do with the actual physical work of art, and that we as a culture give value or confer value onto objects. That value is not found in the object. And this is a very important idea. Let me give you a counterexample. Many people, going back to the Mona Lisa, consider the Mona Lisa a great work of art. And they consider that that greatness is embedded in the piece of art itself. That all one has to do is expose oneself to it, to see it, to look at it, and we would instantly become aware of this great, deep value within the work. Duchamp was saying that's not the case. Duchamp was saying the value is in the society that decides to give it value. So we as a society have decided that the Mona Lisa and what it represents and its technique and its historical place and history are all things of great value and significance, and therefore we value it. An example would be if we were to take the Mona Lisa and take it out to the middle of the Australian outback and take it to an indigenous group of Aboriginal peoples and show them the Mona Lisa, Duchamp would say they're not going to fall to their knees and think, oh my God, what a great piece of art. They're probably going to say, well, I can use that as a shade, or I can use it as a tea table or something to put stuff on. In other words, the value and the meaning is not hidden in the piece and just radiates out to a people, but the value is created by the people. We enshrine this today in the phrase, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Another way of saying that would be value is in the eye of the culture. And so by saying that value and meaning and artistic quality is not really in the piece of art itself, but in a society that decides so, he's turned the tables on the entire history of Western art. And he's taken the whole idea of culture and meaning and value, and he's placed it inside human agency. It's we humans that do this. And so to take something off a wall found object, put it in a museum, put it in a case, put it in a glass cover. We can create this idea of value and meaning, and that's exactly what has happened to this piece of art in the history of Western art. It's why it's in our textbook, it's why we're talking about it. The other thing Duchamp was doing was he was trying to take this idea of looking at value in art and strip it away from quote-unquote artworks. So by finding the most mundane, most ridiculous piece of thing he could find, something you urinate into and put it into a museum, he was trying to also say, we as a culture take all the objects in our world and we divide them into two big groups. One group is all the things we call art, and the other group is all the stuff we call not art. And art we put in a special building called a museum, and the other stuff we put everywhere else, in our homes, in our places of work. And in this special place called a museum, we have these special objects that we go and we visit, and we are very quiet in the museum, just like church, and we feel that by being exposed to these things, we become cultured people. So for Duchamp, he was trying to say that this line that separates valuable things from everyday mundane things is an arbitrary line. Now what he means by that is, you might put it in one place, I might put it in another, someone else might put it in another. In other words, we will all take certain objects and things in the world that we think have great significance, meaning, and value, and separate them from other things. But where I put my line that makes that separation, or you or anybody else, depends on the person. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Duchamp was saying, what if we took this line, this division, and we threw it away? We got rid of it. What if every single thing we looked at in the world, we gave the same attention, the same reverence, we saw it through fresh eyes as an object of great beauty? Duchamp is saying, what kind of people would we then be, and what kind of lives would we then live if we did not have things we called mundane, boring, stupid, if everything we looked at was, a worthy piece of art in that sense. And so it's a very Zen kind of Buddhist way of looking at the world, where everything is meaningful and everything has value, regardless of whether it's a spoon, a urinal, a painting, or a piece of sculpture. And that the whole act of conferring value and meaning onto an artwork is something that's created by a culture in a given period, in a given time, in a given place in the world. And as time changes and as geography changes, so do those meanings change. And so we have artworks that are famous in one time in history and they're not famous in others. We have artworks that are mocked at by one generation. Think of Nazi Germany and Hitler's degenerate exhibition. One generation they're being mocked up and held up as the epitome of all that is evil and wrong, and the next generation they're great works of art enshrined in museums. And so Duchamp was trying to really expose this entire game, a game really that had nothing to do with the urinal. He was saying, it's not the urinal that has value. There's nothing in it. I'm taking the most ridiculous thing in the world and I'm putting it in front of you to see how you will create this meaning or question this meaning. And so he was all about meaning. He was trying to say, here's an idea about art. This is very different from trying to paint a picture of a landscape or a still life or a portrait. This is a much bigger, almost philosophical, well, definitely philosophical question about the nature of culture, the nature of value, and the nature of meaning. So for Duchamp, he didn't care about the urinal, and if you wanted to pay him $1 million for it, he was going to take it. He's going to say, if you guys are so silly as to give me the money, I'll take it. And that's what his career was. He was playing jokes, he was having riddles, but at the same time he was very serious about what is culture and very philosophical in analyzing culture. But at the same time, if that very same culture wanted to put his work in a museum and give him $1 million, he was the last person who was going to say no. And so he was a very complex figure, very multi-layered figure, but certainly one of the most influential minds and thinkers in terms of 20th century culture. Here's another one of his pieces, bordering again on the nonsensical. It's a piece of glass, and you can read the title down there, The Bride Stripped Bare by Her Bachelor's Even. He had notes, and several hundred pages of notes describing this. And so on the one hand, we're confronted with a piece of glass with some weird shapes on it. And on the other hand, we're presented with this book of information, meticulously describing the nature and the role of every object in there. And so again, it just brought up the whole idea of meaning. Can I look at something meaningless and fabricate some sort of meaning or deep meaning or story behind it and thereby imbue it with value? And Duchamp was saying yes. Of course, that's what we do all the time when we create things or we recognize things as having value to us. But again, Duchamp was saying the value is in the human being. So he'd be the first person to say that holy water, for example, there's nothing different between holy water and Evian water. They're both water, except that one person's belief system will value one water over the other. And so this was his whole premise, is that meaning is in society. And then finally, another piece by Duchamp. Like I say, he was serious on the one hand, and he was a jokester, trickster, punster on the other hand. And so someone put it to him, can he create a door that is open and closed at the same time? And so he went about designing a door that, yes, when it's closed on the left side, it's open on the right, and when it's closed on the left, closed on the right, it's open on the left. So he was able to sort of play with these silly problems and ideas, but at the same time just have a lot of fun with it. So World War I was seen by many as an eruption. Everything fell to pieces, everything went crazy. Out of that, Duchamp came with his ideas and the whole idea of meaning and value. But one person who was also very influential in the 20th century was the psychoanalyst Sigmund Freud. What Freud did was he talked a lot about the conscious and the unconscious, or the subconscious. And he said that our conscious lives are driven and controlled by unconscious desires and fears. And that if we suppress these, or if we ignore their existence, or try to pretend they're not there, they will erupt, and they will erupt in the form of individual psychosis or neurosis. Many people saw this analysis as describing European culture in general, that as a society represses and hides and hypocritically denies its dark underside, that society itself will erupt, and that eruption will be chaotic and traumatic. And so for many people, Freud's theories and Freud's ideas really explained what happened in World War I and why it was what it was. And so psychology, psychoanalysis, Freud, Carl Jung, these all became very, very influential writers and thinkers that the artists were very much involved with in grappling with these ideas and trying to understand them. And so many artists after Freud began to think about, well, how is it that I can sort of access the unconscious, understand the subconscious, experiment with it, see what's there. If it's really the controlling element in our lives, how can I learn more about it? And so Freud's techniques and his methods were something that artists began to pursue. One of those artists was the writer André Breton, a Frenchman who formed an organization of artists known as the Surrealists. The Surrealists were very much like the Dadaists, although where Dadaists were destroying things and poking fun of culture and deconstructing the nature of meaning, the Surrealists were trying to find a way to put it back together, to find a meaningful interpretation or a meaningful structure within which to build a new art and a new society and a new future. And so as an organization, they put out their own manifesto. This is the Surrealist Manifesto, where they talked a lot about what they were doing and why they were doing it, and a lot of the ideas behind it, and quoting a lot of what Freud had to say. And so one of those ideas was learning how to access the realm of the unconscious, and one of those routes was through dreams. And so artists began to explore dreams, and more importantly, dream imagery. So this is an image by Max Ernst, rather bizarre bird-headed creature. Ernst was taking elements of animals and humans and combining them together. And these are the sorts of things you would find in dreams, you would not find in the real world. And so artists began to image this night side of ourselves. And if you think about it, if you're 21 years old, you've been asleep for a total of 7 years in your life. If you're 30, you've been asleep for 10. If we sleep for roughly 8 hours a day, that's a third of every day we're asleep. And so the Surrealists were saying, where do we go? What are we doing there? What is this world we visit? for 1/3 of our lives but know very little about. And so they began to explore it quite consciously. Now, you also have to remember that for the first time in Western history, we're having images like this appear. Everybody had dreams, but nobody really saw pictures of dreams. So these were quite extraordinary images that were very powerful and had a long-lasting effect. I'll just show you a few more Dorothea Tanning. So here we have just regular things, people and flowers, but the scale is all mixed up. The flower's too big, the hair's going the wrong direction. Very kind of strange moods and psychologies and thoughts. Bizarre creatures, bizarre objects. Some of them were having borderline representational things and non-representational. We look at this as very abstract kind of sculpture. Looks like it's in a real space, throwing a real shadow, but the objects themselves don't seem to make a lot of sense. And here Salvador Dali's most famous painting, The Persistence of Memory, where he's taken something like clocks, time as being an absolute backbone of our world that is ticking away constantly, and he's made it fluid and soft and wet and non-substantial. A very enigmatic painting. People still fight over its interpretations and its meanings. De Chirico, who was looking at perspective and working with lots of different types of perspective to create feelings of vertigo or nausea or anxiety. And we can go all the way back in Western art history, and there are not very many examples that show anything similar except for this gentleman. Hieronymus Bosch is one of the strangest painters, working in Europe around 1500, doing very unusual scenes that were hallucinatory and dreamlike. But he was not setting a trend. He did not have a school. He was a one-off, really bizarre artist that many of the surrealists began to look back to and to relook at his works and revive a new interest in the work of Bosch. Magritte, a Belgian painter, playing on the idea of concepts, images, and words. This is French for "this is not a pipe," but you're looking at it and you think, well, it is a pipe. What does he mean by it's not a pipe? And ultimately what he means is it's an image of a pipe. It's not a pipe. And so the idea of image versus reality is something that the surrealists began to explore at a very philosophical level. Is what I see, what is there? And so Magritte would play with visual puns, again, reflections of someone from behind, impossible situations, things that would create some sort of pause in your thinking and your looking, or type of disruption that would make you go, aha, or oh, or they would just take something very normal and mundane and just change something about it. And this is known as a cognitive dissonance, holding two dissimilar ideas in your head at the same time. And so the surrealists were all about trying to disrupt our normal way of seeing the world and to wake us up to a world that is ever changing and ever becoming and ever new, and that by having too many habits of mind, we tend to get stuck in ruts of just taking things for granted as what they are, when they were trying to really show a world that is really alive and full of a lot of changes and meaning, but all of that tends to get crusted over in habit and routine. So their whole idea was to be disruptive, but disruptive for a constructive purpose, to see the world fresh, rather than the Dadaists, which some of them were just trying to be destructive for destructive's sake. There's a picture of Dali painting. I don't know who the photographer was. And this surrealism also, like we saw a few images ago, took a very abstract notion, turned into squiggles and doodles and blobs. It wasn't always about recognizable objects. Automatic drawing, where the artist would just draw whatever comes to mind, very much like automatic writing or free association, where you just keep writing and you don't analyze what you're doing, was another technique that Freud pioneered in terms of accessing the unconscious. Just kind of doodle and see what comes out, see what comes up, without being an editor and saying, oh, that's good or that's bad or that's right or that's wrong, and just being very automatic. Drugs was another thing these artists experimented with heavily. Anything to get outside the typical European civilized mentality and to explore another side of reality. And this led to an American movement in art known as abstract expressionism, which we're going to look at in next week, the final week of the course, but I thought I'd just show you one example here. As you can see the sort of visual similarities between what this painter, Jackson Pollock, was doing in relation to the Surrealist movement before him. Obviously this is much more organized and given much more form, but we are getting more into this kind of automatic, doodling, ritualistic almost way of making images. And Pollock again. Another examples of surrealist disruption. This is Salvador Dali's Lobster Telephone and Merritt Oppenheim's Cup and Saucer or Object. So here she's just changing one aspect of the mundane everyday object, the cup, the spoon, and the saucer, and putting it into fur, and the reaction that it creates in the way we think was seen by the surrealists as an important sort of rewiring of our brain cells, sort of a crack in the cosmic egg, so to speak, where we began to think about things more and not take things for granted and see them in a different way. Other movements between the wars were not so much based on the unconscious. One of those was the Bauhaus movement, which we saw a little bit last week in terms of the architecture. And the other one is a movement in Holland called De Stijl, of which Mondrian was their most famous artist. And what Mondrian was trying to do was arrive at a spiritual language. We've seen this attempt before. We've seen Kandinsky trying to do it. And here we have Mondrian trying to find a basic language of black and white and primary colors and organization and lines that he felt would communicate on a spiritual level across all peoples and cultures, and we saw that also with the Russian constructivists, but that horribly failed. Mondrian was much more successful, largely because his designs and his images were not limited to canvas and painting. They took the forms of furniture. He had a great influence on many sort of applied arts, objects design, furniture design, packaging design, and even sculpture and architecture. So we begin to get the first sort of really modern style houses and modern style buildings based on various schools of thought, whether it's the Bauhaus or Mondrian here with the red, yellow, black, and white. Corbusier's Villa Savoye, you can see the building is based on those geometrical structures, very simple, very efficient and economical. You park underneath. There's an under garage. Lots of windows, no ornamentation. Very much like the art that was being done at the Bauhaus. And this is the Bauhaus building where a lot of the artists came. And the Bauhaus had a sort of social mission where they wanted to take the arts off the walls of museums and make art part of everyday life in the way that I was talking about Duchamp earlier. They wanted every aspect of our life, our clothing, our beds, our furniture, our rooms, our houses, to have an aesthetic dimension to it and to get away from the elitist notion of the artist making some elitist piece of work that we stick in a museum somewhere. And that movement in architecture, Mies van der Rohe was the leader of the Bauhaus at one stage, led to this kind of skyscraper building development, to the large glass and concrete and steel cubes and rectangles that have dominated our cities between the wars and after the wars. And you can see its precedents went way back. Here's the Louis Sullivan building in 1894. So it wasn't brand new. It didn't just pop out of nowhere. It slowly grew out of the historical soil, so to speak. But this abstraction, this modernism, this international style, this surrealism, this Dada, these were all contemporary things that were very big in the cities, in New York and Chicago and San Francisco. But other parts of America had different styles of art, and they weren't necessarily taken by the abstraction or the modernism that we've seen in the previous work. They had a more sort of parochial style or local style that still favored sort of realism, but realism turned on the modern life. And so here we see Edward Hopper's Nighthawks, and we see the sort of the modern alienation of late at night in a cafe, in a diner, the sort of silence, the loneliness of artificial light in the modern world. And we have to remember all this is new. To us this seems quaint and old-fashioned and nostalgic, but these sorts of rooms lit by the electric bulb, the cities and the people that lived there, was all really, really new in the modern sense. And so painters and artists were responding to this in many styles, not just a modernist style. Probably one of the most famous American paintings at this time was Grant Wood's American Gothic. Wood didn't care at all for the modern styles that were coming over from Europe. Still very much a traditionalist. And here he is trying to make a painting about the hardworking Midwesterners, upright, puritanical, hard workers. And for some reason, and it's pretty inexplicable why this painting became so famous. Maybe it struck a chord with Middle America and that idea of back to the farm and back to the roots and back to church and being hardworking. This is actually a portrait of his sister and his dentist that he dressed up with the pitchfork, and the house behind him still exists today. And so this next slide, you can see the house there. Here's the house today. And so Grant Wood got the name American Gothic because of the window, which is a Gothic window with a pointed arch on top. And you can see it back here in the painting. And so there are different styles of art going on, and that's important to remember through everything we've been looking at historically. The historical record, the textbook, picks out what it thinks are the great works of art worth mentioning, worth thinking about, and worth discussing. But like Duchamp was trying to point out, that decision is a decision made culturally. It has really very little to do with the artwork itself. And so Duchamp would be the first to celebrate this kind of work and say, there's all sorts of work going on out there, and please don't be limited to your idea that if it's in the textbook, that was the most important stuff. And we see that with American art at the turn of the century and between the wars, that there were many, many schools of art, many, many styles of art, and there always have been.